My name is Elijah Turner, and this is the truth of my life. I worked my entire adulthood to give my family stability, food on the table, and a home built with my own hands. I believed that loyalty and sacrifice would be returned when my strength faded. I was wrong. One winter evening in Atlanta, my children handed me $35 and an old winter coat and told me I could no longer stay. I stood outside the house I built, the cold pressing against my chest, and I did not cry. I simply turned and walked away. That night, the air was sharp and wet, and the sky hung low with rain. I stood near the front door holding the coat they gave me, waiting for a word of kindness that never came. My son, Marcus, would not look at me. He said they could not take care of me anymore. My daughter, Renee, stood behind him, silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. My daughter-in-law folded her arms and said nothing at all. I asked if I could stay until morning, just until the rain passed. Marcus shook his head and said they needed space. Before I could speak again, the door closed. The sound echoed through my chest. That house was mine once. I laid every brick with my own hands when I was young and strong. Now I stood outside it like a stranger. Years before that night, the house was already slipping away from me, even though I still lived inside it. After my wife passed, the bills began to pile up quietly. Medical expenses, repairs, and debts I did not talk about ate into my savings. I told myself I could handle it. I always had before. When the roof needed work and my credit was already strained, my son offered to help. He said it would be easier if the house was temporarily placed in his name so he could secure a loan. He promised it was only paperwork, nothing more. I trusted him. I signed without reading every line. At the time, I believed family paperwork was safer than banks. I was wrong. The loan kept the house standing, but it also shifted control. Slowly, decisions stopped being mine. Repairs were no longer discussed with me. Changes were made without asking. I told myself it did not matter as long as we were under the same roof. As my health weakened and my income slowed, the balance of power changed completely. What was once my home became his house in conversation. I noticed it first in the language, then in the tone. When arguments happened, they ended with reminders that the house was no longer legally mine. Each reminder landed like a quiet eviction notice. By the time I realized what I had given up, there was nothing left to reclaim. I had traded ownership for trust, and trust does not appear on deeds. So when my son stood in that doorway years later and told me to leave, he was not removing me from my house. He was removing me from his. And that truth hurt more than the cold ever could. The rain soaked my shoes and the shoulders of my coat. The money sat heavy in my pocket. $35. That was the value of my lifetime of sacrifice. I walked down the street without direction. The windows glowed with warm light inside other people's homes. I passed the corner grocery where I once bought food for my children. The smell of bread made my stomach ache. I found shelter beneath a bus stop on Auburn Avenue and sat on the bench, wrapping the coat around myself. It did little to fight the cold, but it blocked the wind. I stared at the money again. My entire life was reduced to a few bills and borrowed warmth. I felt no anger, only silence. I spent that night awake, watching headlights blur through the rain. Pride kept me from going back. I would not beg. When morning came, my joints stiff and my back aching, I stood and walked again. I did not know where I was going, but I knew I would not return to that house. I slept the next night beneath an overpass near Decatur Street. The concrete was cold, but it kept the rain off. I used part of the money to buy bread and water and ate slowly, saving every bite. People passed without noticing me. I had become invisible. By the third morning, hunger sharpened my thoughts. I walked until I found a small freight loading yard near the edge of the city. Men moved boxes from trucks, their faces tired but purposeful. I asked if they needed help. Most ignored me. One supervisor finally said I could sweep the dock for a few hours. The first few nights outside were not dramatic, just exhausting. Hunger came in slow waves, not sharp pains, and the cold settled into my bones like it planned to stay. I learned quickly that the streets were not loud with danger, but quiet with indifference. No one cared enough to harm me, and no one cared enough to help. I learned which alleys stayed dry when it rained and which streetlights stayed on all night. I memorized the sound of delivery trucks and the rhythm of early morning traffic. Survival became a routine, and routine made fear manageable. I washed my face and hands each morning in public restrooms, careful not to draw attention. I tried to keep myself clean, not for pride, but because dignity was the one thing I could still protect. Some mornings I stood outside coffee shops, not asking for money, just watching people hurry inside for warmth. I reminded myself that I once lived that life too. That memory hurt, but it also reminded me that I belonged in the world, even if the world had forgotten me for a while. I met other men sleeping near the overpass. Most of them didn't talk much. We shared nods instead of words. Everyone had a story, and everyone kept it to themselves. One older man named Clarence warned me never to sleep too deeply. "You can rest," he said, "but never disappear." I understood what he meant without asking. On my 4th day outside, I nearly spent all my remaining money on a warm meal. I stood in line, holding the bills, calculating whether comfort was worth the risk. In the end, I bought something small and saved the rest. That decision taught me discipline. I realized hunger could be managed, but hopelessness could not. So each day I gave myself one goal, no matter how small. One conversation. One opportunity. One step forward. When I finally saw the freight loading yard, it wasn't an opportunity that caught my attention. It was a movement. People were busy. Work was happening. That meant value still existed there. Asking for work was harder than sleeping outside. Rejection carries a different weight when spoken aloud. Still, I asked anyway. When the supervisor finally agreed to let me sweep, I felt something return to me that I had not felt in days: permission to exist. I treated that broom like it was a tool of survival. I worked carefully, methodically, refusing to rush. I wanted to be remembered. That first payment felt heavier than its actual weight. Not because of its value, but because it proved I could still earn. I did not celebrate. I calculated. Food, transportation, shelter. Every choice had consequences now. The work was physical, but the learning was mental. I paid attention to how shipments were tracked, how mistakes were handled, and how leadership functioned under pressure. I realized quickly that strength alone would not save me. Understanding systems would. The supervisor, Harold Johnson, was not kind, but he was fair. Fairness was enough. Some days, my body wanted to quit before my mind did. I learned how to push just enough without breaking. At night, I wrote notes on scraps of paper, recording what I observed during the day. Patterns became plans. When rain returned, I no longer feared it. I had survived worse already. Weeks passed, and my presence at the yard became expected. That expectation mattered more than praise. I started arriving early, not to impress anyone, but because the quiet helped me think. One morning, Harold asked me how I thought a delayed shipment should be handled. I answered honestly. He nodded. That nod stayed with me. Trust did not come suddenly. It arrived inch by inch. I managed to rack up some money from my work and finally rented a one-room apartment. I sat on the bed for a long time, listening to silence that felt earned. I slept deeply for the first time in months. Workdays became longer, but easier. I no longer wondered if I would survive. I wondered how far I could go. I stopped thinking of myself as a discarded man and started thinking of myself as unfinished. Learning replaced regret. Planning replaced pain. The memory of being turned away still existed, but it no longer controlled my decisions. I understood something important during that period. No one was coming to rescue me, and that was not a tragedy. It was freedom. Independence taught me responsibility in ways comfort never did. Each small victory carried weight because it belonged only to me. By the time opportunity expanded, I was ready for it, not desperate. Strength had returned to my body, but clarity had settled in my mind. The man who walked into the next phase of his life was no longer chasing approval. He was building permanence. What began as survival slowly transformed into direction. Direction became ambition. Ambition became the purpose. Purpose gave meaning to every painful step that came before. And by then, the streets no longer defined me. They had simply trained me. I worked until my arms burned. When I finished, he paid me $10 and told me to come back the next day. It was the first money I earned after being thrown out. I used part of it for food and saved the rest. I saved every penny. For weeks, I returned to that yard. I swept floors, stacked crates, and carried loads heavier than my body liked. At night, I slept under the overpass. Slowly, the fear of being useless left me. I had a purpose again. After 2 months, I saved enough to move from my previous apartment to a better one near Edgewood. It had 1 bed, 1 chair, and a window that faced an alley. To me, it was a sanctuary. I no longer needed the blanket my family gave to me. I cooked simple meals and slept without fear. The supervisor noticed my work ethic and taught me how to manage shipments and schedules. I learned quickly. I studied logistics manuals at the public library after work. Knowledge became my weapon. A year later, I was promoted to floor manager. I earned more, saved more, and lived simply. I did not think about my family anymore. My mind stayed focused on the future. One afternoon, a trucking company brought in a shipment no one else wanted to organize. I volunteered. I worked through the night, rerouting deliveries and fixing errors. When the job finished on time, the company paid extra. My supervisor shook my hand. That moment changed everything. I was offered a partnership in a small logistics startup. I invested my savings carefully. Over time, the business grew. I opened a second loading facility, then a third. 5 years after sleeping under an overpass, I owned multiple freight yards across Georgia. My name appeared on contracts. Banks called. Investors listened. I remained careful and humble. The first house I bought was not a victory. It was a return. I recognized it the moment I saw the listing, even though the photos made it look smaller than I remembered. The porch rail I had replaced myself was still there. The tree in the yard had grown taller, its branches stretching farther over the roof than they used to. This was the house I built with my own hands, the one I signed away years ago believing my family would protect it better than banks ever could. It was also the house I was later told to leave because I put my trust in the family. By then, it had already passed through paperwork and silence and time. It no longer carried my name. It carried my son's. And then, quietly, it carried someone else's. I visited the house alone before making an offer. I stood in the empty living room where my wife once laughed, where my son learned to walk, where I thought I would grow old. The walls did not accuse me. They waited. I did not feel anger. I felt unfinished. I bought the house without telling anyone. When the keys were placed in my hand, there was no ceremony, no relief. Just a steady calm. I did not move back in. I did not need to. Owning it again was enough. It closed a chapter that had been left open too long. I thought that would be the end of it, but several months after I bought my old home, I saw another listing that made my hands go still. It was my son's house. Different streets. Different history. This one my son had built himself, years after I no longer had a place in his life. I had never lived there. I had never stood at its door in the rain. But I knew what it represented. It was proof of how completely our lives had separated after the night I left my own house behind. I did not feel satisfaction when I read it. I felt gravity. Life had brought the story back to the same place, and this time, it was asking me to finish it properly. I called the agent and asked for the price. I did not negotiate. I did not hesitate. I scheduled the signing for the following week and said nothing to anyone. On the day of the signing, I arrived early. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I sat at the table alone, my hands folded, my breathing steady. I was not nervous. I had already lived through the worst moment of this story years ago. When my son walked in with his wife, they did not recognize me at first. Time had changed me. My posture was different. My clothes were clean and pressed. My presence no longer asked for permission. Marcus froze when our eyes met. The color drained from his face. His wife stopped mid-step, her hand tightening around her purse. Neither of them spoke. We sat across from each other in silence while the agent explained the paperwork. Every word sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. My son kept glancing at me, as if waiting for anger, accusation, or triumph. I gave him none. I read each page carefully and signed my name with calm precision. When it was his turn to sign, his hand shook. The pen slipped once. He apologized quietly, not to me, but to the air. I said nothing. The room felt heavy, thick with everything we had never said to each other. Years of silence sat between us, unmoving. When the final document was signed, the agent slid the keys toward me. They made a soft sound against the table. That sound was louder than any argument we could have had. I stood, took the keys, and buttoned my coat. My son finally found his voice, but it broke before any words came out. His eyes were wet. His shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. I looked at him, then really looked at him. I did not see an enemy. I saw a man who would live with that moment far longer than I ever would. I spoke once, quietly. You gave me $35 and a coat and told me to leave. I used what you gave me. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. I turned and walked out before he could respond. I did not wait for apologies. I did not need explanations. Outside, the air felt lighter. The weight I had carried for years finally slipped off my shoulders. As I drove away, I realized something important. I had not taken anything from them. I had only reclaimed what life had already returned to me, my dignity. That was the last time I needed to stand in that place. The story did not need another word. Years passed, and the city changed around me. Buildings rose where broken sidewalks once were. New faces filled old streets. But I never forgot the places that shaped me. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I drove past the overpass where I once slept. I never stopped the car. I only slowed down, letting the memory pass through me like a cold wind I no longer feared. People often asked me how I did it. They wanted a formula, a secret, something they could copy. I never gave them one. What I learned could not be taught. It had to be lived. You do not find strength when life is kind. You find it when there is no one left to save you. The hardest truth I accepted was this. The night my family closed the door on me did not destroy my life. It stripped it down. It removed everything false and left only what was real. My will. My discipline. My refusal to disappear. I used to think justice would feel loud. I imagined arguments, apologies, tears. Instead, it arrived quietly. It came in the form of keys in my pocket, peace in my chest, and the ability to sleep without fear. The people who once dismissed me did not need punishment. Time handled that for me. Today, when I lock my door at night, I pause for a moment before turning off the light. I remember the man who stood outside in the rain holding $35 and an old coat, wondering if his life was over. I honor him by living well. Not loudly, not angrily, but fully. Because the greatest victory was never proving them wrong. It was surviving long enough to prove myself right.